Thank you.
Among right-wing political circles, Nayib Bukele, El Salvador's president, is one of the most popular men in Latin America and perhaps the world.
Gracias. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Déjame así. Thank you. Déjame así. Thank you.
In 2019, he was elected as an outsider, taking control from the two main historic political parties. Yet, it is not commonly mentioned that Bukele's political career and even fortune as a political publicist were carved under the protection of the FMLN, a radical left-wing former guerrilla, now one of the two aforementioned main political parties. In fact, you can find videos of Bukele defining himself as a non-Marxist leftist.
I personally consider myself as a leftist. And when I say leftist, please don't compare me to Nicolas Maduro or the FMLN, because there is a decent left in the world. And that means I seek to reduce the wealth gap, for there to be less poverty, quality healthcare, education, for there to be infrastructure, good jobs for people, and in El Salvador's case, security.
Bukele has invested in the security apparatus of the state to face an emergency that seems to be under control by now. However, it is not clear what is the next step for the Central American nation. What kind of development and investments are being planned or applied to improve the life of Salvadorians? So how have these promises translated to the ground and the lives of everyday people? We spoke with Michele Recinos, Salvadorian journalist and author. Her latest book, Liberties, contains short stories that mimic the lives of real characters in modern El Salvador. In July 2023, Recinos' book came under indirect censorship when the Salvadorian government successfully issued an ultimatum to remove the book at a book fair in Guatemala. Michele Recinos, thank you for being with us. We greatly appreciate your time and ideas.
Gracias a ustedes por la invitación.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Gracias.
El presidente Nayib Bukele sin duda ha cambiado El Salvador. Hay muchos cuestionamientos alrededor de todo esto. President Nayib Bukele has undoubtedly changed El Salvador. There are many questions surrounding all of this process, of all kinds. After that initial shock wave of operations and the capture of all these people, have the waters calmed down? Where does the situation in El Salvador stands now? ¿Se han calmado las aguas? ¿Dónde está ahorita la situación en El Salvador, digamos?
Hay analistas, gente pues que se dedica precisamente a ese tipo de trabajo de análisis político, ¿no? Que lo describen como una especie de bomba de tiempo, porque, bueno,
There are analysts, individuals dedicated precisely to that type of political analysis work, who describe it as a kind of time bomb because we have been in a state of exception for 2 years since 2022. It became the norm, suspending 3 constitutional guarantees for citizens, allowing what we call street judges, primarily the police, to make arrests. Initially, there were large-scale operations, but now we see more isolated arrests, which still maintain an arbitrary nature. So first, it is necessary to analyze why the exception regime was implemented. Since Bukele came to power, there has been a decrease in homicides and violent acts, but what triggered the establishment of this regime was what was called the bloodiest weekend of the century. In 3 days, a large number of deaths occurred, though I don't have the exact number at the moment.
Pero lo que ocasionó que se instaurara el régimen fue...
What I see now is a calm, but it is a tense calm. For instance, in certain historically stigmatized communities where violence was concentrated, people are saying things like, now we can go for a walk, now pizza deliveries are coming in, we can order pizza at home, things that couldn't be done before. Of course, then, in this sense, it can be said that there has been a change, but the question is, at what cost? Currently, there are reports of about 240 deaths in prisons. The overcrowded and inhumane conditions inside these prisons have been described by organizations like Cristo Sal, as well as by journalistic reports. And we need to remember the historical levels of violence and the damage caused by gangs to the population. Sometimes people, especially those of us with certain privileges, may forget or fail to fully appreciate what the population has suffered. Of course, I'm not saying all of these violations of human rights are justified. But if we intend to analyze why the denial of constitutional rights is so widely accepted, we need to consider the context. In fact, a recent survey from UCA, a university that often conducts such surveys and works extensively on human rights, shows that during this time, the regime has its highest approval rating from the Salvadoran population, around 8.1, if I recall correctly. So it's an applauded measure, but what we're seeing now is a justice system that seems to have collapsed, rendering it useless. Arbitrary arrests based on anonymous calls, reminiscent of the Civil War era in the 1980s, are becoming common. Last week, for example, a human rights defender's mother was arrested following an anonymous call. The other reason why I believe that a justice system doesn't really exist is because there are instances where individuals are released shortly after their arrest due to social media pressure, highlighting the arbitrariness of the system. But what about those who don't have known relatives or cannot access this kind of virality? It's absurd that if your case goes viral, you might get out. But if not, you may languish in jail with no real investigation. In terms of human rights, transparency, and corruption, the state of emergency exempts the government from any scrutiny, even on issues of public funds.
Cualquier auditoría en temas de fondos públicos.
And even though the great majority, almost everyone, millions of Salvadorans are happy with what we are doing, there was a woman who said, "The president is such a good man, but with what he is doing now, we can't support him any longer." She said she was happy with all the things that the government has done, management of the pandemic, providing food and computers for children, but she was upset because we had arrested her son. I'm talking about the 50 or 60 people that went to protest outside the prison gates. The gangs are entangled in our society.
And while the security model undoubtedly delivered on its goals and made the country a safer place, it is unclear when it will stop. When will this war on terror end? To understand the scope of things, we researched Salvadorian press about this issue, and very quickly started to find reports like the following, published by La Prensa Gráfica on April 10, 2022.
When they got out of their vehicle, a police officer approached them and asked to check both their phones without offering further explanation. Another officer ordered Fernanda and her boyfriend Carlos to stand against the wall with their hands on their heads. When her mother came out to see what was happening, police ordered her to stay put. They detained her stepfather as well, and she says her 7-year-old sister was left inside, crying without understanding what was happening. Residents recounted how police and soldiers began taking people out of their homes, inspecting their phones, and repeatedly checking their personal documents. El Salvador's Minister of Security and Justice, René Moreno Monroy, arrived at the location in a van. The minister got out. He only came to try to get a photo, said Fernanda. They were all ordered to bow their heads and told if they disobeyed the order, they would be placed on their knees, like the men. Police took photographs of the residents. The armed forces subsequently wrote on Twitter that they located the, quote, terrorists and collaborators, unquote, who were allegedly threatening the inhabitants. Hours later, the tweet was deleted. Around 11 p.m., they began to load the men into patrol cars. I asked why they were going to take them away. A soldier came and pushed me with her gun and told me that we were to blame for living in a poor and marginal area, and that is why they were taking away the righteous and treating them as sinners, says Milani, who still reports anxiety about what happened. Around 21 men were arrested that night.
My next question is related to what you just told me. Has the government used the emergency powers to fight a class war? Has it been used for social struggles such as repressing unions, students, or similar groups?
Que se ha amasado, como tú cuentas, se ha usado para luchas sociales, es decir, para reprimir sindicatos o estudiantes o cosas así.
Pues no visto así directamente. Es decir, no es que ha habido una
I haven't seen it directly. That is to say, it's not as if there has been a protest that they've rounded up all the people, which are the most visible signs of this type of repression. However, there are union leaders, environmentalists, and human rights defenders who have been captured. And of course, the narrative that the government presents when announcing the arrest is something everyone supports. How is this possible? How can the National Police, through its Twitter and Facebook accounts, portray those captured as if they are already guilty in some kind of sensationalist media trial? I don't know. And obviously, in the tweets, it says the subject is under investigation because they may be a gang collaborator. But of course, if you're feeding this narrative to a society tired of all the gang abuses, they're hardly going to fight for a fair trial. So maybe it's not as visible, but yes, in one way or another, it is also affecting social leaders.
pero sí es de una u otra forma está también ya afectando a líderes sociales, pues.
¿Hay algún proyecto, te parece a ti, de país, digamos?
Is there any project, do you think, for the country, or rather a project for after stabilizing the country from violence and gangs? But what lies beyond that? In other words, they build prisons, they incarcerate a sector of the population, they instill fear, and what could even say discipline to stabilize society. But what lies beyond? What is El Salvador? An agricultural, industrial country? What can people work on to avoid becoming gang members? What is the alternative?
La gente puede trabajar para no hacerse pandillero. ¿Cuál es la alternativa, digamos?
Sí, creo que para eso se puede ejemplificar estas últimas elecciones que se dieron, bueno, en un contexto de régimen de excepción.
I think this can be exemplified by the recent elections that took place in the context of an emergency regime. These elections had characteristics of an unconstitutional nature that have not occurred since 1930, if I am not mistaken. Our Constitution prohibits re-election, yet this man was re-elected, making him an unconstitutional president. And while this propaganda apparatus was always present, there was no real proposal. No, there was no presentation. For example, things like the National Health Plan are classified. In other words, this man is going to re-elect himself, yet it is not like he had a proposal in health and one in education. No, there was absolutely none of that. The only thing that the propaganda emphasized was the same. If you don't vote for the deputies of Nuevas Ideas, which is the official party, you don't vote for the president. This is what is going to happen. The gang members are going to be freed. If you follow that logic, the only thing they offered was to maintain the emergency regime. So I think that allows us to get an idea of what government plans these people have. In other words, there are no tangible proposals. I even believe they are non-existent because, of course, all information is classified. We don't even know if it exists or if it doesn't exist at all because it is classified. Right now, the Bukele administration is targeting the issue of tourism, but in reality, it is gentrification that they are attracting. They say foreign investment, yet it is not clear how. I think there's nothing. It's just that there's nothing. It's an absurd thing. There is nothing. We know nothing. We have no idea what Bukele's plans are. The only thing we know is that he is dedicated to the emergency regime. So that is perhaps the only thing we are sure of, that this state of exception will continue. Let's see for how long, but it will continue.
Y eso es quizás lo único que tenemos seguro, que esto va a seguir, saber por cuánto tiempo, pero va a seguir.
Si me permites,
What is
todavía
the
creo que
state of
tenemos un
public
poquito más
health?
de tiempo.
When you go to a health center, for example,
Cuando
in
uno va
San
en
Salvador,
a un
let's
centro de
suppose if I
salud,
were there and I had to go to the health
sé, la
center with my
salud,
kid,
en qué
what does that
está,
health center look like?
si
Are there
vives ahí, se
medicines? Is
enferma
there
mi hijita,
investment? Are
me
there
llevo al
health
centro de
centers? Are
salud.
they
¿Cómo
private?
es ese
Are they
centro de salud?
public?
¿Hay
How good is
medicinas,
that
hay
service?
inversión, hay centros de salud, son privados? ¿Cómo es eso?
Sí, la verdad es que hay centros de salud público, está el IS, el Instituto Salvadoreño del Seguro Social, digamos, y la red de hospitales públicos.
The truth is that there are public health centers. There is the ISS, let's say the network of public hospitals. Historically, they have provided deficient service. In other words, we cannot say that it is the responsibility of one specific administration. I mean, this has always been a misfortune, let's say. But what they now question is, for example, the constant renovations to health units because it is only a facade. One of his promises was the remodeling of the Rosales Hospital, which is the largest hospital in El Salvador, located in the capital, and is the most representative. But this hasn't happened. As I said earlier, things like the fact the National Health Plan was declared secret, I think that says a lot. Access to doctors in El Salvador is deficient, which, as I say, is not the fault of this government because it has always been like this, but there is no interest in really proposing new policies or elaborating a new doctrine. No, I mean everything remains the same. That is a deficient state and no dignity for patients.
Eso es un estado deficiente y nada de dignidad para los pacientes.
Supongo que si pudiera reformular la pregunta, podría ser, ¿y qué tal sobre educación? Y es un poco más...
What about education? Furthermore, it's clear that El Salvador is investing in prisons, in police, and in all that. Is there that same type of investment in schools? Because that is the difference between states that invest in their people and others like Milei's Argentina, who want to disinvest in the state. It gives the impression that Bukele is someone from the right who will invest in the state. Is that so?
No, por ejemplo, el ejemplo más tangible es la Universidad de El Salvador, que es la única universidad pública.
No. For example, the most tangible example is the University of El Salvador, which is the only public university and it's on the verge of bankruptcy. They haven't allocated a budget to it. They don't know how many millions they owe it, but they haven't paid the budget. And I think that alone says a lot. And not to mention, for example, the public school networks, especially in the peripheries, in the most rural areas, is the most forgotten areas. So there is no interest in improving the issue of social infrastructure, that is health, education, no, none of that. And the fact the University of El Salvador is on the verge of bankruptcy speaks volumes at the level of priority the regime is giving the issue of education.
Creo que dice bastante del grado de prioridad que el régimen le está dando al tema de educación.
Look, I heard about you for the first time when there was that instance in which the Salvadorian government put pressure on a Guatemalan book fair to censor a series of your short stories called Liberties. Tell me a little bit about that and what you learned from all of it.
Claro. Bueno, para resumir más o menos
Of course. Well, to summarize what happened on that occasion, it was the second book that I published, and I published it with a renowned Guatemalan publishing house, FIG Editores. The themes of my writing are deeply permeated by the dark reality that we live in El Salvador and Central America. The book includes 2 short stories that were awarded and address different current issues of violence in El Salvador. One of them was Barbers on Strike, which won the Mario Montefort Award from Toledo. It is believed that this is the story that caused all this problem because it describes, of course, through fiction mixed with elements of reality, what the beginnings of the emergency regime were like. If I'm not mistaken, we've already had 26 extensions. Well, I don't remember exactly how many there are, but it has been in force since March 2022. So essentially what happened was that El Salvador was the special guest of the Guatemala Book Fair. I was attending with my book for this event, and due to the pressure, presumably from the government of El Salvador, the Salvadoran representative stated, if she presents the book at the book fair, we, as El Salvador, who are special guests, will leave. It was an ultimatum. Many people criticized the actions, or rather, the book fair and the cultural community of Guatemala, but I'm not justifying them. But I think it's understandable because it happened just a few days before the event, and such actions require a lot of planning. When your main guest tells you, no, I'm going to leave things lying around or not going to attend, I suppose it was a strong humiliation. So they decided to remove my participation. In the end, the book was still published. The presentation was held on the same date as the book fair, but in a different venue. That's what happened. It's been a little difficult for me to recognize it as an act of censorship, because I think I am also influenced, perhaps unconsciously, by the idea that censorship only involves prohibiting the sale of a book or some cultural product, you know? But for an institution to actively seek to prohibit this book presentation in the same space where they are, wow. So that's pretty much the situation.
Entonces, eso fue prácticamente lo que sucedió.
To conclude, when you were doing the research for your book and this series of stories called Liberties, surely you came across many cases that should have caught your attention. Is there anything you might want to share with this audience here in the United States about it?
Esta audiencia acá en Estados Unidos.
Pues mi trabajo literario está.
My literary work is totally influenced by my journalistic work. So practically, these stories are mostly ones that I did not manage to be published in the newspaper due to space issues and other constraints that we already know. So yes, I think that when you see how families are separated by the repressive policies of a state, it touches you. Before, people would say, of course. Before, the gang members were the ones doing the killing. But now it is the state that kills you, puts you in prison, where no one is responsible for you, because in the public eye, by the same narrative that the state manages, you are a criminal, because the narrative is you are there because you owed something. Even though the Bukele government has said itself during this entire period they have released around 7,000 people who owed nothing. And of course, there is underreporting. Those are the false figures they give us. So I think there is a normalization of violence, and it really seems like we have to have an executioner. We are just changing the executioner. Before we had the gangs, now it is the state. Now it is the police, the military, those who extort you or take you away. There are cases of young women who have been detained because they did not want to do sexual favors for police officers. And that behavior, where have we seen it before? In the gangs. So yes, these are the things that affect you deeply through my literary work. I tried to showcase them, but I don't know if in the end, I mean, the paper holds up with everything, but I don't know if in the end it can be transmitted that well. All that feeling of misfortune, of misery, I don't know.
Se logra transmitir bien como todo ese sentimiento de desgracia, de miseria, no sé.